It was home to 4 of the 13 original colonies and has been called the birthplace of America ever since. New England. It was here that the Pilgrims first set foot in the New World, where religious exiles built a dazzling city known as the Cradle of Liberty, and where a rebellious Tea Party triggered a Revolutionary War, a war first waged by brave patriots right here on New England soil, where monuments to their sacrifices still stand today. But the story of New England is much more than the birth of a nation. It's also the story of those who fought to secure many of the liberties that Americans hold dear. Their First Amendment right to freedom of speech, the separation of church and state, and the right to bear arms, which militiamen used to defend their land and fight a Revolutionary War. In New England, ancient cliffs are home to the colorful legends of a Native American tribe. A writer named Thoreau famously celebrated the beauty of the natural world. And hard-working fishermen still reap the great bounties of the sea. From the air, there's no end to the wonders of New England, from the brilliant colors that blanket Vermont's mountains every fall, to the pristine lakes on Maine's northern border, to a marvel of the industrial age that still chugs up the flanks of New Hampshire's highest peak, to the rocky shores of Connecticut's stunning coast, and the lively creatures that flock to one tiny Massachusetts island every year to breed. New England may cover 6 very different states, but every fall they unite behind one winning team, right here in the land where the game of football was invented. This is the endlessly fascinating story of New England. In May 1602, an English ship called the Concord approached the coast of what's now Massachusetts. On board was an explorer named Bartholomew Gosnold, who was hoping to establish the first English settlement in America. At the time, this region hadn't even been named New England yet, which is one reason Gosnold felt free to give his own names to the islands and landforms he passed by. He named one Cape Cod, after the fish he saw teeming around his boat, and a nearby island, Martha's Vineyard, after his daughter. But Gosnold and his crew chose this tiny island as the site for what they hoped would be a permanent settlement. A stone monument here on what's now Cuttyhunk Island marks the spot where they constructed a small fort to protect themselves in case they were attacked. But within just a few weeks, they realized they might not survive since they were low on supplies. And so they decided to pack up everything they had and return to England. Gosnold's attempt at settlement had failed, but he did become the first documented Englishman to set foot on what later became New England. He would also earn fame 5 years later, helping settle the Jamestown colony in Virginia. But it would be more than a decade before a new group of English settlers landed here on the Massachusetts coast and finally kicked off the transformation of New England. When the sun rises over Cape Cod, it looks like an enormous arm reaching out into the Atlantic Ocean, beckoning to those who sail past its shores. And that's exactly what it did in November 1620 to the Pilgrims as they sailed past on the most famous ship in American history, the Mayflower. The Mayflower's more than 130 passengers and crew were on their way to the Hudson River in what was then considered Virginia, when a storm forced them to seek shelter inside Cape Cod's comforting arm in what's now Provincetown Harbor. Today, a monument to their historic landing towers over Provincetown. The Pilgrims were fleeing to the New World because they had been persecuted for their religious beliefs. They believed that the Church of England was deeply corrupted, and so they had tried to start a new church of their own, for which their leaders were harassed and imprisoned. This monument is a tribute to their brave journey to seek freedom in America. But winter was setting in, and the Pilgrims and the others on board were fearful of storms and dangerous shoals. So they decided to stay here in New England instead of continuing on. In the middle of December, they pulled up anchor in Provincetown and sailed across Cape Cod Bay to a more sheltered harbor they named Plymouth. Legend has it that upon their arrival in New England, the Pilgrims used a large granite boulder on the shore as their stepping stone to freedom. Today, Plymouth Rock is one of Cape Cod's biggest tourist attractions. There's no evidence from the time that this rock was actually used by the Pilgrims, but it remains a powerful symbol of their pursuit of liberty. Nearby lies an almost perfect replica of the original Mayflower. It was on board that the Pilgrims and others came to a remarkable agreement that sowed the seeds of American democracy. When they had set sail from England, they were carrying a signed charter that permitted them to settle in what was then Virginia. But they had no such permission to start a new colony here in New England, and conflicts soon arose on board about what they should do next. To maintain order, they drew up a simple agreement that later came to be known as the Mayflower Compact. It stated that the colonists would agree to abide by laws and regulations that they would establish themselves, since there were no colonial laws yet in place in New England to govern them. The Mayflower Compact was signed by 41 men on the ship and was the first outline for an independent, self-governing community in the New World. But many of those who arrived on the Mayflower never got much of a chance to take part in their new democratic experiment. The journey to America had been hard, and building a new settlement in the wilderness in the middle of December quickly took its toll. Almost 50% of those who had arrived on the Mayflower died during their first winter from disease and exposure. The survivors forged on and finished building an English village with simple timber houses, plots for farming, and pens for livestock. That first New England colony has been reconstructed here, just outside of town. It's called Plymouth Plantation and is about 1/3 the size of the Pilgrims' original settlement. When spring finally arrived, members of a Native American tribe called the Wampanoag paid them a surprise visit and taught them how to plant corn and other Native American crops that would ultimately help ensure their survival. When those crops produced a bounty the next fall, the Pilgrims and the Indians celebrated their successful harvest together in what is considered to be the very first Thanksgiving. Many famous names in America are descendants of those who arrived on the Mayflower. They include Marilyn Monroe, George Bush, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Clint Eastwood. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Wampanoag inhabited most of the land that's now Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They were farmers, hunters, and fishermen. Thousands of members of their tribe once lived here on the island of Martha's Vineyard, which the Wampanoag called Nopi. On the western tip of the island lie the Aquina Cliffs, which are home to one of the tribe's most colorful legends. Tribal elders still tell stories of a mythical giant named Moshup, who waded out into the waters to catch whales for his daily meal. To kill them, he flung the whales against the cliffs, which turned the earth here blood red. The fires he then used to roast them stained the cliffs charcoal gray. But while many of the Wampanoag's legends survived after the arrival of Europeans, most of the tribe did not. Diseases carried to New England by European explorers and traders wiped out at least 75% or more of the tribe. When the Pilgrims and others arrived to settle New England, there were actually not many Native Americans left to challenge them. Today, roughly 300 members of the Wampanoag tribe live on a reservation centered around their sacred Aquina Cliffs. Thousands of visitors come here every summer to catch a glimpse of the cliffs from the top of Gay Head Light. A wooden lighthouse was first built here in 1799. This one dates from 1856 and is one of more than 200 that still dot the New England coast today. But it's taken extreme measures to keep some of them still standing, including this one on the nearby island of Nantucket. It's known as Sankaty Head Light. By 2007, this famous landmark was perched dangerously on the edge of an eroding bluff. That's when a group of Nantucket residents pooled their funds, bought the lighthouse from the U.S. government, and then moved it almost 400 feet back from the shore. Today, its light still offers guidance to mariners in New England storms. Smaller than Martha's Vineyard and more remote, Nantucket is home to just 10,000 people during the winter months. But come summer, its population soars to 60,000. To get here, most take ferries from the Vineyard or Cape Cod across Nantucket Sound. On their way, these vessels have to steer clear of the sandbars that surround Nantucket's tiny Muskeget Island. This little stretch of sand is home to one of the largest breeding grounds for gray seals in the nation. From December to February, hundreds of these seals flock to Muskeget to breed. But scientists fear that the rising seal population here on the island is a threat to the birds that also call Muskeget home. The remoteness of Nantucket helped keep early English settlers away, at least until 1659, when a group of investors bought it for 30 British pounds and 2 beaver hats, one for the seller and one for his wife. By then, New England was booming. British ships offloaded thousands of new settlers on its shores every year, and they soon fanned out across a region that would ultimately become the 6 states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and the largest of them all, Maine. What kicked off this new wave of settlement was the arrival of the Puritans. In 1630, a flotilla of 11 ships, commanded by Puritan leader John Winthrop, arrived here on the Massachusetts coast north of the Pilgrims' colony in Plymouth. Winthrop soon founded the city of Boston, which became a haven for tens of thousands of Puritans who soon arrived from England in what's known as the Great Migration. To ensure that there were enough clergy for their growing numbers, Puritan leaders established a new seminary just outside of Boston, in Cambridge in 1636. Today, that school is known as Harvard University and is the oldest institution of higher education in the United States. It was named after John Harvard, a Puritan minister and the school's first benefactor. Like the Pilgrims, the Puritans were also religious exiles, but while the Pilgrims wanted to form a separate church from the Church of England, the Puritans only wanted to reform or purify it, which is how they got their name. Boston quickly became the capital of the Puritans' vast new Massachusetts Bay colony. But despite having come to New England to be able to freely practice their own faith, the Puritans ruled Massachusetts with an iron fist. They imposed laws that punished those who failed to follow their strict beliefs. One was a minister named Roger Williams. For the Puritans, there was no separation of church and state, but Williams believed that faith was a very personal matter and should not be governed by law. He was also sympathetic to Native Americans' land rights, which helped turn him into an outcast. Puritan leaders ordered that he be shipped off to jail in England, so Williams decided to make a run for it. He headed west and worked out a deal with the Narragansett tribe to buy land here at the confluence of the Woonasquatucket and Moshassuck rivers. He named the site Providence and declared that it would be a haven for anyone in New England seeking religious freedom. In 1663, the King of England granted Williams and other leaders here permission to join their settlements under a new colony called Rhode Island, probably named after one of the islands offshore. Today, standing proud on the dome of the Rhode Island State House is a sculpture known as the Independent Man. It honors the ideas of freedom of religion and separation of church and state that Rhode Island was founded on, and which later inspired the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Nearby stands the soaring spire of the First Baptist Church in America, which Williams co-founded. Rhode Island's coastal city of Newport also became a haven for those of other faiths. Jewish settlers even arrived here from Barbados in the 1650s. Newport's Toro Synagogue is the oldest synagogue still standing in America. Nearby, the Quakers established their own house of worship. In Massachusetts, Puritans banished Quakers for what they claimed were radical beliefs. For Quakers, God was within each person in the form of an inner light. At simple meeting houses like this one, they gathered in silence until that inner light inspired them individually to stand up and share their thoughts with the others. The idea that God worked directly through the faithful without intermediaries like priests was a radical and threatening idea for the Puritans, as was the Quakers' belief in the equality of women. In 1657, a Quaker woman from Newport named Mary Dyer went to Boston and began teaching others about her newfound Quaker faith. But she was arrested and ordered to hang. Right here in the middle of Boston Common, she was led to the gallows. As the noose was tied around her neck, Dyer declared, "I came to do the will of my Father, and in obedience to his will, I stand even to the death." Mary Dyer was executed on June 1st, 1660, in a city that had been founded 3 decades earlier as a cradle of liberty. King Charles II was so disturbed by Dyer's death that he forbade the Puritans from using capital or corporal punishment on Quakers. Over time, tolerance in Massachusetts grew, and just over 1 century later, colonists of all stripes across New England would unite to fight for their freedom against British rule. If there is any event in New England as famous as the landing of the Pilgrims, it's what happened on December 16, 1773, here in Boston. On that night, thousands of colonists flooded into Boston's Old South Meeting House, the largest building in the city at the time. The meeting had been called by the Sons of Liberty, men who were leading a protest of a new British tax on tea. Now, it was finally time to take action. John Hancock, a wealthy Boston merchant, spurred the crowd on, declaring, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes." Soon after, the Sons of Liberty raced down to Boston Harbor. They boarded 3 ships at Griffin's Wharf and began tossing their cargoes of tea overboard. When they were done, 3 hours later, 342 chests of tea were floating in Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was mainly a symbolic act, but it sent a powerful message to England that America's colonists were getting tired of taxation without representation, since they had no right to actually vote on the taxes and laws imposed on them by the British Parliament. Today, reenactors bring the spirit of the Boston Tea Party alive all day, almost every day, for visitors here aboard a replica of one of the tea-laden ships. But after the real event, Britain took immediate action. Within months, it shut down the port of Boston in retaliation, cutting it off from the outside world. Meanwhile, American rebels began to stockpile weapons in Concord, 20 miles northwest of Boston. When the British learned of the stockpile, they made plans to raid it. On April 18, 1775, 2 rebels climbed to the top of the tallest building in the city at the time, the Old North Church, near Boston Harbor. They had agreed to flash either 1 or 2 lanterns from the bell tower to warn their fellow patriots across the river how the British were beginning their advance. The famous phrase, "One if by land, 2 if by sea," was how poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow later described it in his famous poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Paul Revere was a rebel and silversmith who lived near the church in this house at 19 North Square. After the signal was given with 2 lanterns from the nearby bell tower, Revere and another rider set out from Boston on their famous midnight ride. To avoid British patrols, Revere took a northern route, while William Dawes took a southern one to warn their fellow rebels in Concord of the impending raid. But soon after they met up in Lexington, they ran into British forces. Revere was caught and Dawes was thrown from his horse. But a third rider who joined them, Samuel Prescott, made a daring escape and was the only midnight rider to make it all the way to Concord and inform his fellow patriots that the Redcoats were coming. As the sun rose the next morning, 77 patriots, known as militiamen, were gathered here at Lexington Green, ready to meet the British forces head-on. A statue to those militiamen now stands tall on the green to honor their bravery and the 8 men who lost their lives in that first battle. With the rebels at Lexington defeated, the British moved on to Concord and destroyed what was left of the stockpiles. But the Patriots' numbers swelled, and they soon found themselves face to face with the British forces here at Concord's North Bridge. It was a redcoat who raised his rifle and fired first. Ralph Waldo Emerson later called that bullet the shot heard round the world. As the Patriots fired back, they forced the British into retreat and then pursued and fired on them almost the entire way back to Boston Harbor. In the end, 73 British soldiers died on that day, while 49 militiamen lost their lives trying to defend their freedom. Within just 2 months, the British discovered again that the American rebels were a force to contend with. This impressive stone tower commemorates Boston's famous Battle of Bunker Hill. It was built in 1842 near the site of the battle. On June 17, 1775, 1,200 colonial fighters tried to fight off a British attack launched from nearby Boston Harbor. British troops managed to beat the rebels into retreat, but only after being badly battered themselves. What the battles of Concord and Bunker Hill proved was that America's colonists posed a real threat to the British, despite their better trained and more powerful army. New England had set the stage for America's Revolutionary War. Even today, a fighting spirit is still part of New Englanders' DNA, especially when they fill the stands here at Fenway Park, home of the Boston Red Sox, New England's only professional baseball team, and its famous Green Monster, the more than 37-foot-high green wall that stretches across left field. And in the fall, New Englanders unite outside Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts, to cheer on the only professional football team in New England's 6 states, the New England Patriots, also known as the Pats. Out of their 8 appearances in the Super Bowl, they've won it 4 times, making the Patriots one of the NFL's top 6 teams. Starting in 2001, the Pats were led to victory by star quarterback and triple MVP, Tom Brady. There's a good reason New Englanders are especially passionate about football. They've been fans longer than just about anyone else. That's because the game was pretty much born here in the late 1800s, thanks to a player at Yale University in Connecticut named Walter Camp, who came up with many of the basic rules that differentiate football from rugby. He's been known as the father of American football ever since. In 1903, Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, built the first football stadium in America. It still stands here next to the Charles River. In its early years, college football was a brutal and bloody game. Protective gear like pads and helmets wasn't required. Teams often just fought with each other for possession of the ball. But what's amazing is that college players weren't just getting badly injured on the field. Many were actually dying from their injuries. A Chicago Tribune article called the 1905 football season a death harvest. That year alone, there were 18 fatalities on the field. Many schools decided to ban football altogether. But a coach at Harvard named Bill Reed led a charge to make the game safe. He introduced the forward pass to spread players out, And he proposed a neutral zone between the scrimmage lines to keep them from fighting. Gradually, football became a safer sport and began to thrive again at Harvard Stadium, which was expanded in 1910 with the Roman colonnade that now towers over the stands. Down in New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University built a new football field of its own, even bigger than Harvard's. When the Yale Bowl opened in 1914, it was the largest stadium in the world at the time. Its bowl-like design became the norm for professional stadiums across the country. On their new fields, Harvard and Yale helped forge a comeback for football and make it the game it is today. Ever since, Harvard's Crimson has been facing off against Yale's Bulldogs in their legendary annual matchup known simply as the Game. For more than a century before America was settled by the English, fishermen and adventurers from European countries navigated its rugged northern coast. They often traded with the Native American tribes that had called it home for millennia. Some say that even the Vikings once set foot on New England shores. But England first cemented its claim to this region with the name New England in 1614. That's when an Englishman named John Smith made the first map of the coasts of what are now Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. In a small boat with only the simplest of surveying tools, Smith and his crew documented many of the inlets and natural harbors that still line this coast today. At the time, the English still considered this region to be part of what they called Northern Virginia. It was Smith who first gave it the name New England. 6 years later, his map was carried on board the Mayflower. But it was Smith's reports of the plentiful supply of codfish offshore that led to the founding of New Hampshire just 3 years after the Pilgrims' arrival. In 1623, a group of English investors and fishermen arrived here at the entrance of the Piscataqua River, hoping to catch, salt, and export cod to England. Their small settlement thrived and became the city of Portsmouth. Unlike other early New England colonies, New Hampshire wasn't founded as a safe haven for religious exiles. It was created as a business venture to reap the bounty of the sea. New Hampshire has just 13 miles of coastline, which means it has the smallest coast of any state in the nation. But thousands flock to their tiny wedge of shore every year. They belong to a state that was the first to have its own Constitution and Bill of Rights. People in New Hampshire have been proud of their state motto, "Live free or die," ever since. And if there's any place in the state where people come to embrace that live free spirit, it's here, on the very top of New Hampshire's Mount Monadnock. This is the most hiked mountain in America and the third most in the world, after Japan's Mount Fuji and China's Mount Tai. Monadnock is a Native American Abenaki word that means the mountain that stands alone. It's hard to imagine it today, but Monadnock's peak was originally covered with trees, just like the mountains around it are today. But in the 1800s, settlers lit the trees at the base of the mountain on fire in order to turn forests into pasture. Soon after, they torched the trees again to clear out wolves that they thought were living on Monadnock's rocky flanks. Over time, rain, wind, and water eroded the soil, revealing great ancient rock forms that were once hidden under Monadnock's peak. Today, with its giant exposed globs of schist, quartzite, and granite rising to 3,000 feet, Mount Monadnock is one of New England's most stunning natural forms. But New England's highest peak lies just over 100 miles to the north. It tops out at 6,288 feet and is known as Mount Washington. On clear days, you can look out from the summit right into Canada. But in bad weather, the high reaches of Mount Washington can be a death zone, with some of the coldest and most terrifying winds anywhere on Earth. That's what it was like on April 12, 1934, when multiple storm systems from Canada, the Atlantic Ocean, the South, and the Great Lakes all converged right here on the tip of this New Hampshire mountain. At the time, researchers were hunkered down in this simple observatory that still stands on the summit to measure wind speed on the top of the mountain. In the middle of the night, as the wind howled around them, they were forced to scramble out onto the roof and use wooden clubs to knock the ice off the devices used to measure the wind's velocity. Their efforts resulted in a remarkable finding the next day. At 1:21 p.m., a gust shot the meter up to 231 miles an hour, the highest natural wind velocity ever recorded on Earth at the time. The extreme conditions on Mount Washington were what inspired one of the great wonders of the industrial age. In 1868, great clouds of steam and smoke started blasting into the air as the first mountain climbing cog railway in the world began chugging up the steep flanks of Mount Washington. It was the creation of a New Hampshire engineer and inventor named Sylvester Marsh. In 1852, Marsh and a friend were hiking up the mountain when a sudden storm forced them to scramble to the top and seek shelter in this small stone structure known as the Tip-Top House. That's what inspired Marsh to imagine a railway that could carry passengers up and down the mountain no matter what the weather. In 1858, New Hampshire legislators finally granted him permission to build it, though some thought his chances of success were almost zero. "Let him build a railroad to the moon," one reportedly said. Soon, teams of men and oxen were hauling equipment, timber, and steel up to Mount Washington. To keep the steam engine, cars, and passengers from simply sliding down the tracks, Marsh invented a ratchet or cog that could hold the cars at any place in the track during the steep ascent. It was the first cog railroad design in the world and would soon become popular in other mountainous places like the Swiss Alps. Here on Mount Washington, Marsh's railway has been in almost continuous operation ever since 1869. One of its engines runs on coal and steam, which create these great clouds of smoke. The 3,500-foot journey to the summit and back down takes 3 full hours. But it's well worth it, just for the view. But come fall in New England, there is wonder to behold just about everywhere, thanks to a miracle of science and nature. It's one of the most amazing natural spectacles in the world, and turns entire forests into blankets of red, yellow, and gold. In some places, they're so vivid, they even seem unreal, and make New England's family farms look like they're right out of a postcard. It all starts in late September. The colors of fall foliage first reach their peak in northern Maine. Then, over the weeks of October, they march their way south across New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, and all the way down to the coasts of Connecticut and Rhode Island. By early November, the peak colors start to fade, just as they arrived, as the leaves finally fall from the trees. Scientists are still learning about this amazing natural process. What they know is that temperature, moisture, and the increasing length of autumn nights are the 3 key factors that trigger New England's transformation. As the nights grow longer and the temperature falls, the trees stop producing chlorophyll, which is what makes green leaves green. The trees seal the veins that carry nutrients up their trunks to their branches and leaves. The natural sugars already trapped inside produce chemicals known as carotenoids and anthocyanin that are ultimately what create the leaves' colors. The darkest reds are usually found on the leaves of maples and oaks, while the golds and yellows often appear on birches, elms, and poplars. Millions of tourists from across the U.S. and the world come to experience this stunning annual event in action. But on this October day, just outside the New Hampshire town of Hooksett, a team of local utility workers might just have the best view of all. An aerial lineman is busy at work. He'll spend almost all day on the skid of this lightweight Hughes 500 helicopter, dropping down to work on every single utility pole for miles, like a bee moving from flower to flower. But come November, all the colors around him will disappear. As New England writer Henry David Thoreau famously wrote in his essay, Autumnal Tints, October is the month of painted leaves. Their rich glow now flashes round the world. October is its sunset sky. November, the later twilight. Thoreau's writing famously celebrates the beauty of New England's natural spaces and sets out to prove their virtues to the humans who he thought too often passed them by. Much of his thinking came out of an experiment he conducted here at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. Starting in 1845, Thoreau lived for 2 years on the shore of this lake. He wanted to experience and write about what it would mean to live a simple life surrounded by nature. The book Thoreau wrote, called simply Walden, eventually became a literary classic and made Thoreau a champion for New England's wild spaces. Today, some of the wildest of those spaces can be found in Maine, especially along its rugged coast. With a seemingly endless number of harbors, inlets, and islands, Maine's shoreline is actually longer than California's by 51 miles. It's also famously treacherous, which is why Portland's Head Light was built in 1791, when Maine was still just a part of the state of Massachusetts. From its coast to its western border, the state of Maine covers a vast inland territory that's almost the size of all the other New England states combined. When the morning mist covers the hills on the Maine-New Hampshire border, New England looks like it must have thousands of years ago. But if there's one place that captures the beauty of New England's rugged inland territory, it's this, the Green Mountains of Vermont. They run down the center of the state and are home to the Green Mountain National Forest, which ensures the protection of more than 400,000 acres of Vermont land for public use. When French explorer Samuel de Champlain mapped the area in the 1600s, he named it Vermont, which means Green Mountain in French. After the English settled New England, Vermont did not become one of its original colonies. It became an area of disputed land instead, between the colonies of New Hampshire to the east and New York to the west. The governors of New York and New Hampshire both claimed Vermont and its Green Mountains as their own. Sometimes they even granted permission to different settlers to farm the same piece of land. In 1770, the New York Supreme Court ruled that New Hampshire's land grants in Vermont were invalid. That's when a settler named Ethan Allen decided to strike back. A monument to Allen now stands here in the northern city of Burlington, over his grave. The reason he's a hero in Vermont even today is because he organized and led a local militia to defend his fellow settlers' land claims against those of the New Yorkers, and helped Vermont maintain its independence in the process. Allen's rowdy militia was known as the Green Mountain Boys, a name still used today by the Vermont Army and Air National Guard. The original Green Mountain Boys roamed the countryside, threatening New York settlers and trying to scare them off the land. Thanks in part to Allen and his militia, Vermonters remained free. The Green Mountain Boys also went on to help win one of the most important early battles of America's Revolutionary War. In March 1776, The British finally withdrew from Boston after realizing that they were outgunned by the American army here, which was led by a general named George Washington. But over the coming months, the British still tried to come up with a way to contain New England, where the rebellion of its American colonies had started. They finally decided on a plan to divide and conquer. With a surprise attack, they believed they could isolate the New England colonies from New York and those in the South. The dividing line would be New York's Hudson River. So, in 1777, a general named John Burgoyne led 8,000 troops south from St. John's in Canada and down the Hudson, hoping to cut New England off. But America's patriots rallied to stop the advance. Volunteers from across the region gathered here at the fort at No. 4 in Charlestown, New Hampshire, to prepare to take on the British forces. Led by John Stark, the ragtag and mostly untrained fighters traveled west, where they were joined by the Green Mountain Boys and managed to defeat the British troops not far from the Vermont town of Bennington. Today, the Battle of Bennington Monument honors their sacrifices and what ended up being a major turning point in America's Revolutionary War. It was the beginning of the end of British efforts to divide and rule its rebellious American colonies. The American success here, and soon after at the Battle of Saratoga, was what led France to support American independence and help it win the war. Vermonters may have played an important role in the nation's battle for independence, but at the time, Vermont wasn't even recognized as a U.S. state. It wasn't until March 4th, 1791, 14 years after the Battle of Bennington, that Vermont was finally admitted to the Union. And statehood was only given after Vermont paid New York State $30,000 to settle the land claims that the Green Mountain Boys had fought hard to defend. Vermonters have been a little wary of the federal government ever since. They have the smallest capital in the nation, Montpelier, which is home to just 8,000 people. And they have one of America's tiniest state houses. On the Capitol dome is a statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture. She's the perfect symbol for a state whose nearly 1,000 dairy farms produce more than half of the milk consumed in New England. Milk that also made Ben & Jerry two of the biggest names in ice cream. It was here on the shore of Lake Champlain in the city of Burlington that Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield opened their very first ice cream parlor in a converted gas station on this street corner in 1978. Ben had recently dropped out of college. Jerry decided that making ice cream was a better option than medical school. Their ice cream quickly became famous for its wacky names and trademark chunks, as well as the company's policy of giving away 7.5% of its pre-tax profits to charity. The socially conscious brand was an immediate hit. Today, the company lies here in Waterbury, where thousands of gallons of fresh Vermont milk and cream arrive every day and are churned into frozen pints of Cherry Garcia, Caramel Sutra, and Chunky Monkey. Ben & Jerry turned Vermont milk into a fortune. In 2000, they sold their company to global food conglomerate Unilever for more than $300 million. Flying over New England in the fall is a treat for the eyes, especially when it comes time to harvest one of the nation's oldest crops, cranberries. Before the harvest, each field or bog is flooded with water. Then, farmers drive machines called beaters back and forth to beat the berries off their vines. Inside every cranberry is a tiny pocket of air, which makes it float to the surface and turns these temporary ponds bright red. Next, workers have the tough job of corralling their berries so they can actually be collected. They drag booms across the bogs and then pull them tight, creating stunning patterns and shapes from above. Cranberries were first harvested by Native Americans here in Massachusetts, long before the Pilgrims arrived. Today, Massachusetts is the #2 cranberry producer in the nation, after Wisconsin. These cranberries will be washed and turned into juice, jams, and sauces and shipped out across the nation, just in time for Thanksgiving. When Native Americans along the New England coast needed to fertilize their crops, they turned to the sea and used a surprising resource, one that is now a favorite New England delicacy: the Maine lobster. In the waters off Bar Harbor, Maine, lobster boats are pretty much everywhere, no matter what the weather. They motor from buoy to buoy to pull up the traps that rest on the seafloor below. There were once so many lobsters in Maine that Native Americans scooped them up and spread them on their fields because of the rich nutrients in their shells. In colonial times, lobsters were so plentiful they were fed to prisoners as cheap meat. But by World War II, the Maine lobster had become a pricey delicacy and has since become so important to this state's economy that lobster fishing is now a highly regulated industry. Lobstermen have to measure each lobster they catch. If the body shell is less than 3¼ inches or more than 5, they have to be thrown back. These regulations help ensure that thousands of Maine fishermen keep their jobs. And there's still no shortage of lobsters. In 2014 alone, more than 120 million pounds of lobster were harvested, worth close to $500 million. When the cold winds of autumn start to howl across New England's coastal waters, fishermen all along this coast still head out in search of lobster, as well as haddock, scallops, tuna, and cod. Today, in Massachusetts, a lot of the fish they catch ends up in one place, the most profitable commercial fishing port in New England and America, New Bedford. It's a city that was built on the bounty of the sea in the 19th century. Before oil was pumped out of the ground in places like California and Texas, oil made from the fat of whales was what lit the houses, lanterns, and streets of 19th century America. New Bedford was the biggest whaling port in the nation and is still known today as the city that lit the world. But as the whaling industry boomed, so too did the number of brothels and saloons in New Bedford. To curb the growing vice, the city's Quaker leaders built a new church called the Seamen's Bethel, or House of God. Sailors soon stopped in here to pray that they would survive their often treacherous journeys. One of those was writer Herman Melville. His 1841 voyage from New Bedford on a whaling ship called the Acushnet was what inspired him to write his American classic, Moby Dick. No other book better captures the thrill and dangers of whaling. One reason whaling was one of the world's most dangerous jobs was because the whales were actually chased, harpooned, and then reeled in from small rowboats like these. A thrashing 50-ton sperm whale could easily smash a boat to pieces and drown everyone on board. Today, rowing teams in New Bedford Harbor keep their city's maritime tradition alive as they prepare for the annual Wicked Whaleboat Challenge that pits crews against each other in replica whaleboats. These smaller boats were carried on board massive wooden whaling ships, like this one, the Charles W. Morgan. There were once nearly 3,000 of these vessels sailing the world, but the Charles W. Morgan is the only one of them that survived. It's why she was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1966 and has recently been rebuilt and restored from the keel up by a team here at Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. This historic ship was first launched in 1841. With crews of roughly 30 men, it then spent 80 years sailing the globe, from New England to Africa, Australia, and beyond. On her deck, great ovens turned vats of whale blubber into oil, which was then barreled for market. Until the revived Charles W. Morgan set sail again, the experience of spotting the sails of a whaling ship on the horizon will have to be left up to the imagination. But these days, New England's coastal waters may be more alive than they've ever been, especially over Labor Day weekend. It's the last chance for many here to get out onto the water before they put their boats away for the winter. A modern topsail schooner, the Lynx, gets its last days of good sailing in before the season is over. It's based on the original Lynx, which was one of many private American ships known as privateers that volunteered for service to help fight British blockades of U.S. ports and preserve American independence during the War of 1812. Many of these privateers sailed out of the harbor of Salem, just north of Boston. The rich history of American independence rings out from just about every corner of New England. From the harbors, where its early rebellions flared, to the battlefields, where the sacrifices of a brave few won the liberty of many, to the rocky peaks, where freedom soars today, and the stadiums of its Ivy Leagues, where history was made. It's much more than the birthplace of America. It's one of the most distinctive regions of the nation, with a landscape as varied as any in the lower 48, and rich stories that resonate across every U.S. state. This is New England.